Dying, it's a fact. There's no need for a doctor to tell me. That farewell performance was something I insisted on doing.
He'd relapsed and it was the combination again of the drugs and the drink and
I don't want to disappear silently. I have to say goodbye in person. I thought spinal surgery could...
It was like, no, not again. I've got 10 minutes left and I'm gonna spend it like this, you know?
Save me. But it turned out to be even worse. The combination of nerve damage, infection, and...
The godfather of heavy metal and Prince of Darkness, Ozzy Osbourne, has passed away at the age of 76.
Parkinson's disease crushed me. During the 3 months after the surgery, I was almost a useless person.
The world of music stands frozen in grief and disbelief as Ozzy Osbourne, who was 76, takes his final bow. On July 22nd, 2025, the Prince of Darkness passed away after a long and grueling battle with Parkinson's disease and years of devastating health setbacks. One of his most haunting confessions now echoes like a prophecy fulfilled. The past 4 years have been sheer hell for me. My health has been in a terrible state. This wasn't just a rock legend. This was a man who had stared into the abyss again and kept walking. A man whose every breath was defiance in the face of pain. Parkinson's disease didn't just weaken him. It stole the power from his legs. A horrific fall shattered his spine, leaving him gasping through surgeries in silence. And now, as the world mourns, it's clear that fate has delivered its final and most vicious strike. Behind the shadow of the Prince of Darkness lay a soul gasping for peace. A warrior worn down by endless war. What happened to Ozzy Osbourne is not just another chapter in a tragic life. It's a revelation so painful, so heart-wrenching, it will leave you shaken long after the final note fades. Before we dive in, hit like as a simple gesture of respect for a legend who gave the world everything he had and now leaves behind a silence more powerful than any scream. Before the roaring crowds, before the blazing lights, before the legend of the Prince of Darkness was etched into music history, there was only silence. A silence so heavy it threatened to crush the soul of a boy who didn't grow up to dream. He grew up to survive. In the stained slums of Aston, Birmingham, a young John Michael Osbourne, born in 1948, lived in a cramped, cold home with 6 children and 2 parents who were too exhausted to nurture. His father, worn thin by factory labor, believed emotion was weakness. His mother, hardened by endless hours on the assembly line, rarely had the energy to offer softness. Ozzy, as the world would later know him, was not the clever one, not the charming one. He was the overlooked one, the child who blended into the wallpaper of poverty. At school, he found no refuge. The letters taunted him. Numbers blurred and danced. Dyslexia wasn't understood in the 1950s. It was mistaken for stupidity. Teachers dismissed him as hopeless, and classmates mocked him with cruel delight. The bullying wasn't just names shouted across playgrounds. It was fists in the hallway, knees to the stomach, bloodied lips behind buildings, and no adult ever asked why. At home, there was no escape. Once, after coming home in tears, his father beat him with a belt, not because he was weak, but because weakness wasn't tolerated. Pain didn't get you sympathy, Ozzy would later recall. It got you punishment. And so the silence around him grew louder. He learned to wear it like armor, but armor doesn't heal. By the time he turned 14 in 1962, that silence had become unbearable. In a tiny, dimly lit bedroom, he tied a rope using his mother's washing line, climbed onto a chair, and waited for the world to let go of him. Fate intervened, not with mercy, but with rage. His father burst in and yanked him down, then beat him again, as though violence had beat out despair. Something in him cracked that day, or maybe something finally hardened. He stopped trying at school, stopped speaking unless required. He drifted through adolescence with the blank stare of someone already halfway gone. The sound of laughter became foreign. The mirror showed a boy already fading. At 15, he dropped out with no qualifications, no purpose, and no plan. He worked where he could, at a slaughterhouse on construction sites, in factories tuning car horns. But he was too distracted, too awkward, too broken for any of it to last. Each job ended the same: fired, forgotten, alone. By 17, hunger gnawed at him, not metaphorically, but real physical hunger. His shoes had holes. His shirts hung in threads. And his hope was a crumpled thing he no longer bothered to hold. He was running out of oxygen, not just in his lungs, but in his life. When desperation hit, it didn't whisper, it screamed. In 1965, a botched burglary landed him in Winston Green Prison. Behind those walls, reality hit like iron. In one terrifying encounter, he was attacked by another inmate, and he fought back the only way he knew how, with a metal chamber pot. It wasn't bravery, it was survival. But even in that darkness, a spark refused to die. One afternoon, the Beatles' She Loves You crackled through a prison radio, and something ignited. For the first time, Ozzy didn't want to disappear. He wanted to be seen, to be heard, to live out loud. That moment changed me, he would later say. I didn't know how to play anything, but I knew I needed to be on stage. I needed to scream louder than the pain inside me. That scream became his salvation. Not success, not yet, but a reason to keep going. In that moment, in that prison, the boy who had once begged the world to let him go made a vow. He would not die forgotten in Birmingham. He would be loud. He would be terrifying. He would be unforgettable. And from that decision, a legend began to rise, not from peace or privilege, but from the ashes of despair, where pain forged a voice that would one day shake the world. The shadows of his troubled youth had barely begun to lift when something extraordinary pierced through the silence of despair. A sound, a calling that would anchor his soul for decades to come. Ozzy Osbourne, newly released from Winston Green Prison in 1965 at just 17, wasn't searching for redemption. He was simply drifting through a world that had already decided he wouldn't matter. His 6-week sentence for robbing a clothing store, a desperate act of survival more than crime, hadn't taught him any lessons, only confirmed his worthlessness in the eyes of society. He walked out of that cell, not reformed, but more broken than ever. And then a miracle came, not in the form of a savior, but a song. When he heard the Beatles' She Loves You crackle through a cheap radio speaker, it was as if the world cracked open. It was like hearing God speak to me through music, he later remembered, his voice distant, almost tearful. That moment didn't erase the bruises on his back or the fear in his bones, but it gave him a vision. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to make music. Not polished music, not perfect music, but music that screamed louder than the pain he had carried for so long, that screamed louder than the silence of his childhood, that screamed louder than the darkness he almost gave into. In a tiny, dimly lit bedroom, he had once tied a rope using his mother's washing line, climbed onto a chair, and waited for the world to let go of him. And now, just 2 years later, he was hearing a reason not to. By 1968, that scream had found its echo. A modest newspaper ad seeking a vocalist led him to a rundown rehearsal room in Birmingham, where he met 3 other troubled men. Tony Iommi, a guitarist whose missing fingertips couldn't blunt the fury in his riffs. Geezer Butler, a bassist whose fascination with the occult gave their sound its unease. And Bill Ward, a drummer who played like thunder trapped in human skin. They called themselves Earth at first, but chance encounter with a horror film marquee, Black Sabbath, sparked something more than a name. It became a purpose. If people pay to be scared, Ozzy would later say, why not give them music that terrifies and moves them? They weren't trying to be famous. They were trying to survive, trying to purge something ugly and unspoken. Their songs weren't entertainment. They were exorcisms. They were agony set to distortion. They were grief turned into guitars. On Friday, February 13th, 1970, they released their self-titled debut album. The date alone, dark, ominous, almost cursed, felt like fate. Critics recoiled. They called it satanic, disgusting, unlistenable. But the youth, the broken, the lonely, they listened and they felt seen. In a world where no one asked them how they were doing, Ozzy screamed it for them. That same year, their second album, Paranoid, was written in a rush, almost by accident, yet it became gospel. War Pigs, Iron Man, and the haunting title track weren't just songs. They were lifelines. Ozzy's voice wasn't classically trained. It wasn't even properly tuned, but it was real. It was raw. It was the voice of someone who had clawed his way back on the edge and now dared the world to push him again. I didn't know what I was doing, he admitted later, but I knew it had to be loud. That loudness wasn't just volume. It was vengeance. It was a scream that said, I survived and I will not be quiet. He never learned to read music, never took a lesson, but he didn't need to because his pain was the melody. His wounds were the lyrics, his past was a percussion, and his soul, that was the amplifier. Behind the madman persona, behind the wild antics and stage theatrics, there still lived the boy from Aston, the boy who was told he was stupid, worthless, invisible. That boy was still screaming, but now the world was listening. The early years of Black Sabbath weren't just about pioneering a genre. They were about reclaiming life. Ozzy didn't build heavy metal. He bled it into existence. Every concert, every growl, every riff was a rebellion against a fate he was supposed to accept. And even as fame came crashing in, crowds roaring, records selling, headlines blazing, he remained haunted. The louder the applause, the louder the voices inside him screamed. The success never silenced the hurt. It only masked it. And as the world began to call him a legend, he still felt like a runaway screaming into the void. But that scream changed the world. It built more than music. It built myth. It built memory. It built a legacy forged in torment and somehow resilience. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy Osbourne stood on the summit of heavy metal glory. But beneath the roaring crowd and blinding stage lights, his soul was quietly crumbling. The same voice that once pierced the silence of generation was now being drowned out by inner demons no spotlight could reach. Black Sabbath had become a global phenomenon, pioneers of sound that felt like thunder and spoke to the outcast, the broken, and the angry. But for Ozzy, the louder the music grew, the more deafening his emptiness became. Behind closed doors, he was unraveling, gripped by a storm of destructive habits, haunted by childhood wounds that had never truly healed, and numbed by the crushing weight of fame. Album after album, like Paranoid in 1970 and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath in 1973, elevated the band to iconic status. But Ozzy was slipping into shadows even the stage lights couldn't chase away. His bandmates began noticing the missed rehearsals, the incoherent ramblings, the spark dimming behind his wild eyes. Tony Iommi, once his brother in riffs, grew cold. The air between them thickened with unspoken blame and exhausted silence. Then in 1979 came the final betrayal. They fired him, not face to face, not with dignity. They sent someone else to do it. Ozzy would later recall with the weight of abandonment in his voice. They didn't even have the balls to tell me themselves. That was my band. It wasn't just a career shattered. It was a sanctuary torn from him. Black Sabbath was more than music to Ozzy. It was the one place where chaos made sense, where his brokenness became power. Without it, he was exiled, discarded like a warning label. He disappeared into a Los Angeles hotel room, curtains drawn, soul drowning. I just sat in that room, he would later confess. I numbed myself until I couldn't feel anything. I thought I would fade away in that silence. To the outside world, he was still Ozzy Osbourne, but in that room, he was a fading echo of himself, a ghost with a pulse, a scream trapped inside the man who once taught the world how to scream. But legends don't vanish. They transform. And in Ozzy's darkest hour, something stirred in the ashes. Sharon Arden, daughter of Sabbath's former manager, saw more than a fallen icon. She saw a man not yet finished. She pulled him from the wreckage and whispered the impossible. You were the magic in that band. You can do this without them. Her faith struck like lightning against whetstone. Then came Randy Rhoads, young, disciplined, and unbelievably talented. His guitar didn't just play, it wept, soared, and screamed. To Ozzy, Randy was not just a bandmate. He was a lifeline. Together, they built Blizzard of Oz, released in 1980, an album forged not in celebration, but in survival. Songs like Crazy Train weren't just anthems. They were resurrections. Each lyric, each chord, a defiance. I am still here. I still matter. Looking back, the collapse wasn't the ending. It was the crucible. Ozzy had to be broken beyond recognition to uncover the raw, resilient fire inside. And though the road ahead would be marred with loss, grief, and battles that would leave deeper scars than fame ever could heal, this was the moment his spirit roared loudest. In his own words, "I was out of control, but somehow I kept going. I always kept going." The bond between Ozzy Osbourne and Randy Rhoads wasn't merely musical. It was spiritual, almost sacred, like something from another world. Randy didn't just step into Ozzy's life with a guitar. He arrived like a bright light piercing through a suffocating storm. For Ozzy, still reeling from the shame of being kicked out of Black Sabbath and barely holding on to his sanity, Randy was proof that there could still be beauty, discipline, and purpose in a world that had grown cruel and meaningless. Randy's youth wasn't wild. It was focused. His creativity didn't explode in chaos like Ozzy's, but instead flowed like fire through glass, shaped and precise. Together, they weren't just creating music. They were building salvation in sound. When they released Diary of a Madman in 1981, it wasn't just a follow-up album. It was a defiant declaration. Ozzy, once thrown away as broken goods, now stood again as a force reborn. And it was Randy who helped carve that path. Ozzy once said, "Randy wasn't just a guitar player. He was my friend, my little brother, and the only reason I didn't give up." The connection ran deeper than melodies. It was a heartbeat that sustained Ozzy through a fragile new beginning. On stage, they were electric. Ozzy, raw and wild, and Randy, controlled and amazing. Off stage, there were laughter and deep talks, late-night chats and mutual respect. Ozzy was in awe, not just of Randy's talent, but of his soul. He had this grace, Ozzy recalled, like he knew he didn't have forever, so he made every note count. There was an unspoken urgency to their work together, a shared understanding that lightning doesn't strike twice, and when it does, you honor it. But good times never last. And somewhere deep down, in the calm before disaster, Ozzy would later admit he felt it, that eerie stillness before fate decides to be cruel again. They were flying too high. It wouldn't last. And when it broke, it wouldn't crack gently. It would shatter everything. On the morning of March 19th, 1982, the nightmare Ozzy never saw coming arrived with the silence of a scream trapped in the throat. While on tour in Leesburg, Florida, the band made a routine stop at property owned by their bus driver. There, a small private plane sat idle, a tempting toy on a restless morning. The driver, a licensed pilot, decided to take it for a joyride. Randy Rhoads, always curious and calm, climbed aboard with makeup artist Rachel Youngblood. It was meant to be harmless, a loop in the sky, a bit of thrill before the next long drive. Ozzy stood below, watching, smiling faintly, perhaps already haunted by a shadow he couldn't name. The plane made 2 passes, but on the third, the unthinkable happened. A wing clipped the band's tour bus. In an instant, the aircraft spiraled, plummeted, and erupted into flames upon impact. Randy Rhoads was gone, 25 years old. A bright light put out in daylight. Ozzy ran toward the wreckage, screaming Randy's name until his voice cracked and broke. The flames weren't just fire. They were finality. He collapsed beside the wreck, shaking, weeping, unable to understand what lay in front of him. For hours he was inconsolable. For days he couldn't speak, and for weeks he lived in a blur of numb disbelief. "I lost a part of myself that day," he said later. "It wasn't just Randy's body in that fire. It was my hope, my music, my reason to keep breathing." The man who had been pulled from ruin by a friend was now dragged back into darkness by fate. And this time the fall felt bottomless. Even Sharon couldn't reach him at first. The shows were canceled. The laughter stopped. The house went quiet. It was as if the universe itself had silenced the melody. Randy's death didn't just break Ozzy. It emptied him. And though time would force him to keep walking, a part of his soul forever remained in that burning wreck on that unforgiving morning in March. Ozzy watched in horror as a small plane carrying Randy exploded in a fireball before his eyes. In that instant, a piece of Ozzy died, too. For weeks, he vanished into silence, unable to speak, unwilling to eat, drowning himself in alcohol just to numb the loss. He later said, "Losing Randy was like losing a part of my soul. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to play music. I didn't want anything." It wasn't just grief. It was emotional paralysis. Sharon, once his lifeline, struggled to reach him. Even she admitted, "I thought I'd lost him forever." But from the wreckage of that despair, something unexplainable began to stir. Ozzy began to write again, not to move on, but to remember every lyric. Every scream into the mic became a tribute to the friend he would never forget. Though the pain would never fade, Ozzy knew he had to carry the music forward. Not just for fans, not even for himself, but for Randy. His survival became a form of defiance. And every show that followed carried the weight of a legacy built in tragedy. He wasn't healed, but he was moving. And for Ozzy Osbourne, that meant he was still alive. You'd think the worst was behind him, that surviving the unthinkable would teach the soul how to heal. But grief doesn't follow logic. And for Ozzy Osbourne, the years after Randy Rhoads' death weren't about recovery. They were about descent into a private, relentless darkness that clawed at him day after day until even music, his one salvation, couldn't drown the silence. The 1980s blurred by in a storm of noise and numbness. Each tour felt like a war zone. Each hotel room, a shattered mirror of who he used to be. On stage, the world saw a madman with smeared eyeliner and a mythic persona. But backstage, Ozzy was fading, volatile, unreachable, barely holding on. Sharon, his anchor, tried everything. She had saved him once and refused to walk away. But even her love couldn't always pierce the fog he carried inside. As Ozzy would later admit with a voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't even in my own life. I was just gone." By 1987, alcohol had swallowed him whole. Pills blurred every line between memory and illusion, between waking and escape. Then came August 1989, a night that wasn't born from rage, but from total collapse. A night when Ozzy, lost within himself, did something so devastating it shook the foundation of everything he loved. In a haze he barely remembers, he came dangerously close to destroying the one person who had given him everything, Sharon. "It wasn't me," he later confessed. "It felt like I was watching someone else do it. When I woke up and realized what had happened, I broke. I didn't want to exist anymore." That night, he was taken away, confused, hollowed, unable to comprehend the weight of what had happened. Sharon, with more pain than anger, later shared, "I didn't know whether to press charges or call for help. I just knew something had to change for both of us." And so Ozzy was sent not just to rehab, but to a place where the damage could finally be confronted. The public never saw the details. But behind those walls, without cameras, without applause, Ozzy sat alone and faced the wreckage of the man he'd become, the man his children no longer recognized, the man he didn't either. There were no costumes, no guitars, only silence. A counselor once asked him, "What do you fear most?" And without hesitation, Ozzy replied, "That she'll walk away, that I finally pushed her too far." But Sharon didn't leave. Instead, she came to him, eyes tired but full of fire, and said, "You are still in there. I know it. It wasn't forgiveness. It was war." Every day in that center, Ozzy fought not for fame, not even for redemption, but for the right to keep the love he nearly lost. The battle was brutal. He didn't walk out healed, but he walked out changed. Thinner, quieter, haunted, but also aware finally of how far he had fallen and how precious it was to rise. Years later, in his own words, he would say, "That was when I realized I couldn't keep falling and pretend it was flying. I had to choose to live." After the storm came not peace, but silence so heavy it pressed down like grief itself. A silence not of calm, but of vacancy. Ozzy Osbourne, stripped of bravado, stripped of performance, stood at the edge of the life he'd wrecked, uncertain whether the man he once was still existed beneath the debris. In 1989, after the harrowing night when he nearly lost himself to the darkest version of who he had become, when the woman who had saved him became a victim of his unraveling, Ozzy was arrested and sent not to prison, but to a psychiatric facility. It wasn't condemnation. It was his final reprieve. Inside those walls, there was no music, no lights, no screaming crowds. There was only a man, hollow by guilt and drenched in shame, who barely spoke for weeks. The iconic voice of heavy metal had become a whisper in a dim hallway recovery, echoing only with regret. But outside those walls, Sharon waited. She returned, not out of obligation, but defiance. She saw what others could not. The flicker of the man buried beneath the wreckage. There was still a spark in him, she later said, buried deep, but I knew it was there. And within the sterile halls of that recovery center, Ozzy began to fight. Not an audience, not critics, but the monsters that lived inside his chest. The detox process tore through him like wildfire, burning away not just toxins, but illusions. Every memory, every wrong, every scar was forced to surface. It wasn't healing. It was war. But with trembling steps and raw conviction, he clawed his way forward. Not cured, but conscious. And in 1990, he did the unthinkable. He returned to music, not with the fury of his youth, but with something more dangerous, clarity. Reuniting with Zakk Wylde, the two began crafting what would become No More Tears, an album not born from chaos, but from survival. Released in 1991, it was more than a comeback. It was a reckoning. Tracks like Mama, I'm Coming Home, and Road to Nowhere weren't just radio hits. They were confessions carved from the very core of a broken man trying to rebuild. It was the sound of me trying to be human again, Ozzy later admitted, his voice soft but sure. The world listened. Fans who once feared his silence was final now watched him rise, not as the myth, but as the man. Yet offstage the battle raged on. Each show was a victory, each sober morning a miracle. Sharon remained not as a savior now, but as a soldier beside him, fighting with him, not for him. I owe her everything, Ozzy confessed. She saved my life not once, but every single day. Their marriage, once trembling under the weight of madness, evolved into a testament of endurance, flawed but unbroken. During the early 1990s, Ozzy threw himself into work, as if afraid to stop moving. He toured relentlessly, released more music, and even announced a farewell tour in 1992. But true to his nature, he returned again and again, because though he'd survived, the pain hadn't vanished. It haunted him in quiet moments, whispered through his lyrics, settled behind his eyes, and the audience felt it. Because when Ozzy took the stage and howled into the dark, it wasn't for spectacle. It was survival made sound. It was a man screaming not just to be heard, but to stay alive. Years later, reflecting on those days, he said, I never thought I'd live this long. Every day is borrowed time, and I'm just trying to make it count. For those who knew the full weight of what he'd endured, the prison walls, the near losses, the madness and mercy, it wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection. The Prince of Darkness had looked into the abyss, and instead of surrendering, he clawed his way back, bruised, bleeding but breathing. And though the wounds never truly healed, he wore them as proof that survival is not luck. It's a choice you make in the depths of despair and make again every day after. Just when Ozzy Osbourne believed he had endured every torment life could inflict, when the storm seemed to pass and the scars had finally settled into silence, the year 2019 descended with a merciless cruelty that eclipsed even his darkest days. There were no flashing lights this time, no thunderous crowds to drown out the fear, just a quiet day at home and a single misstep that changed everything. One fall, seemingly minor, became a catastrophe. The very metal rods that had been fused into his spine after the near-fatal quad bike crash in 2003 were dislodged in an instant. It was as if the past had returned not with memories, but with vengeance, ripping open wounds, both physical and emotional, dragging him back into a kind of agony that defied description. Ozzy later whispered in an interview, his voice barely steady, that it was pain beyond anything I've ever felt. A statement chilling in its weight, coming from a man who had already endured a lifetime of torment. But the fall was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new, cruel chapter. Not long after, doctors delivered a second, soul-crushing blow, a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. A silent, relentless enemy that didn't strike all at once, but eroded slowly, cruelly, the very core of what it meant to move, to stand tall, to be free. For Ozzy, who had once commanded the stage with uncontainable energy and fire, it felt like the theft of his identity. The tremors began. His balance faltered. And then came the public confession, raw and unfiltered. I can't walk properly these days. I'm just wobbling. No masks, no rock star persona, just a man stripped down to truth. His words carried not just honesty, but heartbreak. This wasn't simply a diagnosis. It was a reckoning. The world that once watched him defy death now saw him face something more intimate. Time itself. These past few years have been sheer misery, he said in his final years. The words heavy with fatigue and sorrow. The pain, the fear, the sense of losing control. It wasn't theatrical. It was real. Sharon stood beside him, just as she always had. But even her unwavering devotion couldn't stop the quiet advance of the illness that slowly, mercilessly changed a man she loved. And through it all, Ozzy battled not only his body, but his guilt. He had hidden the truth from fans for a time, worried not for his image, but for their hearts. He didn't want to disappoint the very people who had given him strength across decades. But when the truth came out, the world didn't recoil. It reached back. Fans rallied. They saw not weakness, but incredible strength in the man who dared to bear his suffering. And still, despite the chaos in his bones, the tremble in his voice he created. In 2020, he released Ordinary Man, an album haunted by pain, yes, but also filled with something radiant. Defiance. It wasn't just music. It was a statement carved in grief and grit, saying, I'm still here. I still have something to say. Ozzy Osbourne's fight was never just for music. It was for meaning, Ozzy Osbourne's life was a symphony of chaos and creation, a testament to enduring the unbearable and finding a voice in the deepest silence. From the desperate boy in Aston to the global icon, he never stopped fighting, never stopped screaming. His final days were filled with pain, yes, but also an unwavering spirit that continued to inspire millions. His music will live on, a powerful echo of a life lived to its absolute fullest, no matter the cost. What part of Ozzy's incredible, painful, and utterly unique journey touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the lives of legends. Your support helps us keep their stories alive.